All right. And hello, everybody. Welcome to McDuff Lives. I'm John O'Loughlin. And of course, with me to join me once again is our good friend, Harley Schlanger, joining us from Potsdam, just outside of Berlin, Germany, or maybe it's inside Berlin. Anyway, a lot of exciting things going on in Berlin today and yesterday, Harley. How are you? And bring us up to date.
Well, this was extraordinary. The initial figures show there were as many as 100,000 tractors rolling on the streets of Germany yesterday and today. In 100 cities, there were demonstrations. Some of them were very large. In Munich today, there were almost 6,000 tractors. In Mainz, there were about 15,000 people and 300 tractors. These are unprecedented. And the German farmers who spoke were very optimistic. They were saying, look, we're speaking for you. This is not about us. If we don't have the ability to pay for diesel, for fertilizer, if we can't make a living, you're not going to have food. And what they talked about primarily was their contempt for the government. One young farmer said, you're not listening to us. We're not trying to do something against the government. We're trying to do something for the people. And the tractors had signs like, give us our wish, a new government now. Others were saying that the government must listen to the people. It was a very uplifting mood. I was out for a little while yesterday as the tractors were going by in Potsdam. People were out there giving their thumbs up and honking, even though traffic was shut down for miles. Berlin, if you see the picture of the Berliner Tor, the Brandenburg Gate, what you see is traffic backed up for at least 2 miles in both directions. Actually, in all 5 directions, because it's a star. So, and the most important thing is that the police said it was disciplined, it was responsible. The farmers were not going out of their way to cause problems. Now, this is in spite of a media which was hyping this as a mass of unruly peasants, greedy farmers. One article said, farmers have 80,000 euro tractors. How can we feel sorry for them? They ignored the fact that the farmers have to pay for those tractors. So, I think this is a potential turning point in Germany. The ruling coalition is starting to split. The Free Democrats, who are at about 3% of the polls, their leader, Lindner, who's the finance minister, came out and told the farmers they have to go back home. And they said, no, you're the one who has to go back home. The Social Democrats are splitting. There are members of the Social Democrats in a number of cities who welcomed the farmers and called for a permanent rollback in the government's plan to cut subsidies. This was triggered because the government, going back to COVID and then post-COVID, gave subsidies to the farmers to help pay for the increased costs of diesel fuel. And they decided, because of the budget crisis, which was precipitated by this idea of spending another 6 to 8 billion euros for the Ukraine war, which put them over the debt limit. So they said, we have to cut money somewhere, so we'll cut it from the farmers. The farmers said, well, if you do that, you're not going to eat. And so they went on strike. The government immediately came out and rescinded the order, but then they tried a trick. They said, it's sort of like, in the US when you kick the can down the road on the debt ceiling. They said, okay, we'll suspend the subsidies at least into the middle of next year. And what was the middle of next year? March. So the farmers saw through that, obviously, and were quite angry. So there are going to be demonstrations all week. Now, starting tomorrow, the locomotive drivers will be joining them, which means all rail traffic will be shut down. So you have tractors on the highways, you have more cars being driven because people can't get to work via train. So the whole country is going to be shutting down. Schultz's popularity is now down below 10%. The coalition is not even at 30% support anymore. The Greens are in a crisis because the agriculture minister, who's part of the Green Party, is campaigning with the farmers against the green regulations, which are harming the farm sector as well. So it's sort of the perfect storm for a coalition which represents the interests of the financial oligarchy, the corporate cartels, and on top of this now, some of the farmers were highly eloquent in talking about how are we supposed to live? We don't have nuclear power. You put sanctions against Russian oil and gas, so we don't have oil and gas. You're making it illegal to farm unless we abide by the regulations, which mean no fertilizer, no pesticides, even the pesticides that were approved. And the CO2 provisions are going to harm farmers as well. So it's one of these situations where you see people springing to life. And what I liked was a lot of young people, including young farmers, who said, my great grandfather gave this farm to his son, to my papa, and now it's given to me. And I want to make sure this family tradition continues. But that means I have to speak up. And the farmers were calling out the citizens saying, join us, speak up. Don't tolerate these lies anymore. So, from this preliminary report that we have, it's really quite exciting. And the fact that it was 100 cities, and now you have a new party that was announced yesterday, the Sarah Wagenknecht Party, which is the old left party that's actually somewhat of a populist party. The former Social Democratic mayor of Dusseldorf, which is one of the largest cities in Germany, he joined the party. And what are they talking about? No war, no funding for the Ukraine war. And meanwhile, the Social Democratic government and the Greens, which used to be the peace parties, they're saying we need to have a military buildup to make Germany war ready. Speakers from the Swedish government today in the Swedish parliament warned there's likely to be a war with Russia within 2 to 3 years. Where are they getting this from? This is the NATO line. We have to fund Ukraine to the hilt or else Putin's going to come and get us. The Russians have no intention of marching into Sweden or Finland or any NATO country. They're trying to stop NATO expansion, not go to war with NATO. And then the other thing, John, just to throw out another topic, Thursday, the International Court of Justice will hear a case from South Africa accusing Israel of violating the 1948 Genocide Convention. And their case is very strong. It's an 84-page document. If you haven't seen it, you might want to take a look at it because people are saying in the legal profession that it's a very tight case. It includes 10 pages of quotes from officials of the Netanyahu government talking about the Palestinians as animals, as beasts, that there are no innocents. Don't tell me that children are innocent. They're going to grow up and march against Israel. So it's a very compelling case. And now we're starting to see splits occurring in the Jewish community. I just got off the phone with someone who said that the Americans for Peace Now, which is a pro-Zionist organization, has come out and called for a ceasefire. So, maybe 2024 is going to be our year to roll back this military, financial, industrial complex and have the citizens take back the country.
Wow. Well, before I watched a snatch of your program this morning on the LaRoucheOrg.com, where Harley's daily briefs can be watched usually by 8 or 9 a.m. Before I watched that, I titled the show for today, The End of the West. And in other words, a really broad caption, the idea of, the BRICS coming along and the dollar falling and the, Saudis and the Iranians and the Russians getting away from the SWIFT system and all of these things that have been pointing to many people, at least, to the idea of the fall of the West. Of course, the stock market's still very sound, and I don't see Wall Street trembling at anything that's going on in the world right now. Nevertheless, it's fitting because now we can go back and examine your topics you just mentioned in that light. Just because a bunch of farmers showed up in Berlin and 100 cities doesn't mean that the West is going to survive this. And to me, if it really is between guns and butter, and the government picked guns, and now the farmers are out saying, you can't eat if we don't grow food. We went through this in Canada. What was it, 2 years ago? The truckers went on strike, and they got a lot of terrible press. But what difference is there? Now you say this is going to go on for a week, without trains in Germany for a week. That to me is really frightening, because most, at least as I recall being there, most people rely on trains. I mean, not that they don't have cars, but trains are a primary source of getting to work for many people. And so, and then the farmers, they're going to tie up the traffic. Well, Trudeau didn't put up with it for very long, and he started seizing people's bank accounts. The truckers were punished, and I don't think they've recovered yet financially from what was done to them just because they did this. How are the German farmers any different? Are they going to be able to weather the storm that's coming from the government to try to force them to back down? Or are they just going to take buyouts like we heard of going on maybe 6 months ago when the same thing was happening in the Netherlands? I don't know if farmers are taking buyouts, but at a certain point, everything has a price. Well, those are my questions back to you on the German farmers.
Well, it's interesting. There were Dutch farmers who were in Germany joining the march. There were groups of American farmers that are working with us that sent messages of support to the German farmers. There's something similar going on in France. In France, they're a little more earthy, you might say. They drive what they call honey wagons, that is, wagons loaded up with cow manure, drive them to the homes of government officials and dump the manure on their porch. Now, the Germans, some of them were going to do that, but they decided not to, because they didn't want to, you might say, didn't want to create the wrong kind of stink. But one interesting thing that happened is Habeck, who's the finance minister, was on a ferry trying to come home. And he lives in North Germany, and the farmers blocked the pier so the boat couldn't arrive, and he had to go to another city further away. And immediately people came out and called this terrorism. And the farmers said, we're not allowed to express our view, and this actually built the more sympathy for the farmers. Now, the question you're asking, this is the $64 million question. What happens when a government turns on its people? Now, in Canada, Trudeau did this blatantly, brutally. And I think it did send some shivers of fear among a whole section of what you might call Canadian patriots who weren't prepared to take on the government. But the thing you have to look at is, who's the government in Canada? Who does Trudeau represent? He represents the British monarchy. He doesn't represent anything that's Canadian. Now, in Germany, these people who are making these policies, the Greens, the Free Democrats, the Social Democrats, they have, in general, had a completely free access to their population, their citizens. Now they're running away from them. So are they going to resort to police state tactics to suppress popular revolt, or will they change the policy? And this is where the real question becomes, is there an alternative plan that can be implemented that will allow for a peace based on mutual benefit and economic growth? Now, that's the problem in Germany. No party has a competent program. We do. And we're circulating our program as we are in the United States. We've just drafted something called Turn Swords into Plowshares, which is a legislative act for cutting back the incredibly huge defense budget. You probably just saw this, John, yesterday. They reached an agreement for the next year's budget, and it's almost $1 trillion for defense, but nothing for roads, nothing for transportation, nothing for ports, nothing for teachers, nothing for healthcare. They're talking about a slight cut in big pharma, what they can charge, but on the whole, the American people are getting a foot on the throat. Maybe not as blatantly as Trudeau did, but what will happen in any of these countries? Now, ultimately, I think the solution is that we've got to get people in the global north, the global west, America, Europe, to look at what's going on in Africa, in Asia, in South America, where governments are deciding to side with the people against the cartels. And we saw this with coups carried out in a whole bunch of the countries in West Africa. We're seeing it with Egypt and South Africa, taking actions to fight against the genocide in Palestine. So, how much will this gravitate toward war? And the problem here is that the US policy continues to be the use of military force to impose a unipolar order. And I just wrote an article that'll be up on my website, I think tomorrow, on what is the origin of the rules-based order. And it goes back to a 1992 paper, which is called the Defense Planning Guidance, which was drafted under the direction of Paul Wolfowitz. So it's called the Wolfowitz Doctrine. And Wolfowitz did this under the direction of Albert Volstetter, who is a former top leader of RAND, part of this London, University of Chicago, Stanford team that really makes up the core of the military financial complex. And so we're getting out the story, who's benefiting from these wars, who's making profits, who's making the decisions, and what can you do to change your life? And so the real question is, will the population decide to be led like cows to the slaughterhouse, or will they stand up and fight for their basic rights? And that's something I can't answer, and nor can you. I mean, we can do our advocacy, we can argue, we can persuade, we can present solutions, but ultimately every individual has to make a decision as to whether they want to live like a free person and act on the basis of free will for their future, or will they give away that freedom to faceless bureaucrats acting on behalf of these private special interests? So that's my answer to you. Will it happen in Germany? Well, the last time there was this kind of situation in Germany, you had communists and Nazis fighting in the streets. This time you have, in a sense, the left and the right joining against the oligarchy. So this is a potential turning point in human history. And the inspiration for this, to some extent, is coming from watching what the BRICS and the Global South are doing to fight against the new colonialism.
When you go into the question of individual rights, of course, my own fight against the mandatory imposition of an injection that violates my own sovereignty, my own bodily integrity, has cost me a lot over the past 4.5 years. And many other people have tried to stand up against the juggernaut of government-imposed health care. But around the world, I don't see any governments left that are standing up against it. Some of those African leaders early on, it appears to have been gotten out of the way or perhaps assassinated for doing just that. So the shadow of COVID and the horrific lockdowns that we were forced into, as well as those people that had first responders in particular, other people that had no choice. This is the playing ground or the background of this current question of do individuals still have rights in the governments that exist on the earth today. And that fight, I think, in Canada was an interesting place to see it unfold. To see it unfold in Germany, any different, frankly, would surprise me. I think Germany is still pretty much under the thumb of NATO and the Atlantic Council and Wall Street financiers of all the horrors of the past. So I wish I could be hopeful, but I'm afraid that this is just going to get crushed.
Well, let me take it to a slightly different theater, which is that the people who are controlling these, pushing these policies, also thought they could defeat Russia in Ukraine. They thought they could continue the brutal colonial policy in Gaza. And that's still a question whether that's going to succeed. There's splits occurring in the Israeli government, very significant splits. So the question then becomes one that Friedrich Schiller wrote about, which is that ultimately, is there a possibility for human beings to act on the basis of natural law to overcome the power of the tyrants? And that's really, historically, there have been few moments where people did rise up and overthrow the imperial powers. And usually there are moments when the imperial powers, out of their arrogance and their blindness to what they were doing, punched the ticket of their own demise. So, I think Helga put it very interestingly the other day. She said, the people we're fighting are not very clever. They are persistent, they have power, but what they're doing isn't working. And, what happens if the pipeline of raw materials is shut down? What happens if the OPEC countries decide to stop supplying oil and natural gas? What happens if the green revolution is denied lithium and cobalt and the other raw materials? So, we're coming into a transition period. I don't think it's going to change tomorrow. I mean, you're right about Germany. There's a pattern of passivity in the German people, but we're seeing that change right now. And the fact that these demonstrations were so large and so generally supported by the public is a sign that maybe that passivity is going to change. And the other problem, John, is that people in the West are being denied a picture of what's happening in the rest of the world. And, I think the fact that South Africa has chosen to take on Israel on the issue of apartheid and human rights violations is quite significant. Now, the International Court of Justice is not the same as the International Criminal Court, which is completely controlled by the oligarchy. The International Court of Justice is a UN body. It remains to be seen what happens if they find Israel guilty. But there'll be a ruling on this sometime in the next couple of weeks. And it'll give us more of a picture of our sovereign governments prepared to stand up for what they know to be legitimate rights. So the question isn't, are we right or wrong about whether you can win? We're right about the infringement on people's basic rights, the destruction of sovereign nations, the destruction of living standards and economies and healthcare. We're right on all of those issues. We're also, I think, the LaRouche organization has been right on the alternative economic policies. That doesn't mean they're going to be implemented. That's why we're in a period of struggle, which will probably take a while. But the real issue now is, can we inspire in enough people an ability to think critically outside of the controlled environment, outside of censorship? And the fact that you had so many people in Germany in the streets when they were told there are going to be riots, chaos, right-wing extremists are going to come in and beat people up. I mean, some of these reports were horrifying. It's almost as though they were talking about a Hamas invasion in Berlin. And instead, it was orderly, well-mannered, very much accepted. So we'll see if the righteous anger can rise to the level where some of these political leaders are going to be brought down. There are elections coming up in several states in Germany in the next couple of months. And it's probably the case that the polls are showing that the Social Democrats will probably be knocked down to about 10%, which would be the lowest level they've had since the 1930s. The Free Democrats are going to be knocked out of government completely. The Greens are now at about 12%, and the Christian Democrats are at about 26%, but they can't form a coalition with anyone. And by the way, the head of the Christian Democrats is an old BlackRock official. So, there's no solutions within the system. So people are going to have to look outside the system. Well, people shouldn't be scared of that. There are solutions coming into shape.
I saw on Helga's Twitter post this morning on that point about swords into plowshares, and of course, a wonderful image. All of the cannons could be turned into tractors, and we could have 200,000 tractors parading through Berlin, celebrating the peace of the world. And all of the cannons in the world could be turned into tractors and farm implements. That would be a beautiful, beautiful thing. And one thing that I think goes along with that is the relief of debt.
Yes.
I watch recently been very interested in Michael Hudson's videos. I don't know if you know him. He was with the Hudson Institute for a long time, but he's very, very interesting speaker on the question of debt. And he wrote an entire book about jubilees and biblical jubilees, and how ancient civilizations, whenever the king would change or die, something, there would be a forgiveness of debt. Just like all debts are canceled. Boom. Without getting rid of the debt that we're all burdened with, we all still have to get in the car every morning, drive that 30 miles to the office, go upstairs, get some coffee, and sit in your cubicle and do your damn job. We have to get rid of this horrible, horrible burden of debt that obviously is just a house of cards built in an incredibly ornate and Baroque style that just needs a few of the cards to pull out, but then there's disaster. So how do we face this problem of excessive? We've talked about it many times. That is the horrific problem that every family faces. Is you've got a mortgage, you've got a car payment, you've got to pay for school, you got to save money for college. It's just too much with the price of rent in New York, for instance. We were talking with Diane Sayre, the Senate candidate, the LaRouche organization's candidate for Senate, about how horrible that is. And other folks with your organization have spoken to that. But this is the rentier class cashing in. The rentier class, meaning, just 200 years of people's legacy from their great-great-grandfather who sold dope to the Chinese. And they just sit back and receive the money and go skiing and buy sports cars and live the fat life. There needs to be some resentment against this horrible, horrible explosion of debt and elitism that we're facing in the world right now. And so maybe some resentment might be good in trying to wake people up. I certainly do feel it. This horrible financial system has just cast a net over creativity, sense of freedom, and frankly, it's depressing enough to make people willing to give up their liberty for a sense of security.
Well, I think the resentment is there and is building. But let me just go back to a couple things you said. You mentioned Michael Hudson. You'll probably not be surprised to know that many, many years ago, he was in a regular dialogue with us, including with LaRouche. And much of what he's saying today about debt is what LaRouche was saying in 1975 when he launched his campaign for the International Development Bank. LaRouche at the time brought forward the idea of a debt moratorium, debt forgiveness, and a jubilee as something that would be based on having to determine what portion of the debt is legitimate and what portion of the debt is illegitimate based on usury and speculation. And the debt that's from usury and speculation, which is the vast majority of, for the United States, $33 trillion now, that should be wiped out. The debt that's owed for real physical goods production, you have to figure out how to extend it and do it over time. When Franklin Roosevelt carried out the bank holiday in 33 and the Glass-Steagall, what they did was they gave banks time, the banks that could show that the debt they were holding was legitimate, they gave them time to figure out how to either liquidate it, sell it, or turn it into something that was credit. Now, that's the trick of the American system of Hamilton. Hamilton took the debt of the American Revolution and marketed it based on the idea that the US government would guarantee the debt through its investment in infrastructure and physical economy, manufacturing and agriculture. So that you're taking something that's worthless and you're not giving it to the speculators. You're having the government take the part of it which is based on people's savings and things of that sort, and making sure that it is fungible. That is, that there's something real behind it. And that's what a credit system is. That's what the Hamiltonian credit system is all about. Now, I had a discussion with a Romanian economist the other day who was saying, look, we don't know what to do. We have all this debt. We can't pay it. What can be done about it? And he and I went through a discussion of what Hamilton did with the first 4 letters he drafted to the Congress to deal with public credit, debt, and the National Bank. And I said, read these documents and get back to me. The next day he called me up and he'd studied them. And he said, this is fascinating. I mean, governments actually can take this kind of power. And I said, well, they can do it if they're backed by the people. And the problem is that when you have the present system, where the people who the debt is owed to, the people who think they're rich because all these pieces of paper are owed to them, they can buy a lot of individuals. They can corrupt congressmen. They can use military and armed forces and police to protect themselves. What happens when they lose that protection? And I think that's the state of the world we're moving to. I think Helga was making the point the other day that this is one of these moments in 600 years where a system which has been entrenched going back to the 15th century, 16th century, is collapsing. You know, the period when the nation states first started developing as a result of the work of Nicholas of Cusa, Leibniz, the Peace of Westphalia, that was the big break with the old Roman Empire system, but it didn't defeat it. And the Roman Empire system moved from Rome to Venice, and from Venice to Amsterdam, and from Amsterdam to London. And now it's London and Washington, or London and New York. So, you know, it's not invincible, but it requires something that is pretty much unprecedented, which is a global coordinated rebellion. That's what we're trying to do. And that's why, you know, I spend a lot of time talking to media in Pakistan and South Africa and Lebanon and Algeria, as well as in the US, to try and get these ideas out. And what I'm finding just from my personal networks is more and more people are saying, well, why didn't I hear about LaRouche before? You know, what you've said, John, that, you know, this makes sense. What can we do to get this accepted? We have to fight, and we have to fight against psychological blocks, because people have been told, don't expect anything good, don't expect justice, go along to get along. And that's the how the system survives, is getting people to accept the idea that you have to make compromises.
Yeah, moral relativism.
Yeah.
For decades. And that is the imperial system. And as you say it is the Roman system, and you can think of Boris Johnson in a toga, you know,
Oh,
writing
please,
books.
no.
No, well, no, you know, he's got the olive leaf and everything, and he wrote a book about how great Rome was, and this is it. You're exactly right. It is the revival of the empire, the Roman Empire, and you know, I have to challenge the idea that citizens now, as we've been talking about, do we still have the power? That's the question I guess we're discussing this morning. Can the Canadian truckers succeed in 2024 as opposed to getting the hell beat out of them in 2022 or whenever it was? And can these truckers in Germany actually ignite people's passions to say, God damn it, they are right. The farmer is the man that feeds the world. We need to support our farmers. The problem, I think, is that the politicians, number one, they choose stupid people to be the politicians.
Stupid and corrupt.
And number two, they're all corrupt. And so number three, there is an enforcement mechanism to this corruption. You know, we're running a damn Murder Incorporated, said Lyndon Johnson, and he was right. And look what happens if you buck the system here. And, you know, so what I see is the so-called governments that claim to be sovereign are not sovereign. These people are all people put in positions so that if things go bad, they can get blamed, but the real power behind the scenes is never blamed. And I think a great example of that is what's going on with Zionism right now, because we have this huge upswing of people that are realizing that, you know, Zionism is not just I like Jews and I like Israel and let Israel survive. Zionism is this political movement of geographic expansion to cover the entire Middle East from the Mediterranean to Iraq. You know, just completely subsuming Lebanon, Syria, the Sinai, all of these areas of Saudi, all of this territory that they claim because of a real estate contract with God back in 3,000 years ago. And they're serious about it. Well, I don't think that it's just them promoting this. I think that we're getting taught to blame Zionism for all of the sadness, all of the horrors in the world. But as you and I have talked many times, you know, Zionism is a product of the British Empire.
Yeah.
And how do we get people to stop thinking, geez, if only we can get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu, the world will suddenly turn into a reasonable place where we can achieve the smart economic program of a Lyndon LaRouche and reassert our individual rights and get on with beating those swords into plowshares. How can we convince people to stop focusing on, you know, the shiny thing, which right now is this political Zionism?
Well, 2 points that I would make on that. First of all, to go to the broader point, in 1989 in East Germany, there were small groups of people, 10, 12, 15 people, who gathered on Monday nights in Dresden and Leipzig, which was in Eastern Germany, which was a dictatorship. It was a dictatorship that had been propped up by the Soviet Union, by the Warsaw Pact military. Remember the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union marched into Hungary in 1956. It marched into Czechoslovakia in 1968. It went into East Germany in the 50s and into Berlin. So this was an established dictatorship, and it completely controlled the media, controlled day-to-day life. They say at one point, 1 out of 4 people, residents in East Germany, had some connection with the Stasi, the secret police. And in 1989, this system started cracking. And Erich Honecker, who is the dictator of East Germany, gave a speech, and he said, this East German Reich will be in existence 1,000 years from now because of the will of the people. And a month later, he was shipped out of the country to a hospital in Chile or Peru. His government collapsed, and the communist dictatorship of Eastern Europe was brought down. It wasn't brought down by Ronald Reagan. It wasn't brought down by George Bush. It wasn't brought down by NATO. It was brought down by the people of Eastern Europe who rebelled against being treated like ignorant peasants with no sense of value to them. Now, I bring that up because I'm seeing something happening in Israel right now. I'm in touch with some people in Israel, including some very prominent civil libertarians, political networks, who 2 months ago wouldn't talk to me because they said October 7th was so brutal, you can't talk to us about Hamas. Or I said, I'm not talking to you about Hamas, I'm talking to you about Israeli civil society. No, the people of Israel, we may not like Netanyahu, but we're committed to this war. That's changing. Remember, in September of 2023, a month before the Hamas attack, there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the street protesting Netanyahu's attempt to rig the judicial system to stay in office. That's starting to happen again. We're seeing the Israeli civil society rejecting Netanyahu's government. There are hundreds of Israelis who are signing letters now, prominent Israelis signing letters calling for the removal of these greater Israel fanatics like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the national security advisor, or Smotrich, who's the finance minister. These are the people saying you have to drive all the Palestinians out. Smotrich said, well, instead of 2.2 million people in Gaza, if there were 10,000 Palestinians, it would be easy to control them. Well, how are you going to get down to 10,000 Palestinians? Ship them all over the world? Kill them? Well, there are people in Israel who are now saying, we're not going to go along with that. Now, I don't know whether that's a powerful enough force yet, but I think we're seeing the situation shift in the world. We're seeing Biden sending this clown Blinken around once again saying, well, we'll send you weapons, we'll let you kill them, but kill them more gently. You know, people look at Blinken and the rules-based order and they basically say, these people are insane. No one can possibly tolerate this, but they do. So, John, you know, the only thing I can say is we have to keep looking for people who are willing to open their eyes and look outside of the censorship bubble that controls them. Do you think the East German press was in favor of bringing down the Honecker dictatorship? You know, there was the joke for, and many of my young associates here now in Germany were young in East Germany in the 70s and 80s. They called their country the Valley of the Clueless because they had a completely controlled media. They had no idea. I don't know if you remember this, but there were stories about people in East Berlin who hadn't seen a banana or an orange in 30 years because of the control of the country. And all of a sudden it disappeared. Now, the power of the West at that point was too overwhelming for this to become a thorough victory. And so we lost an opportunity in 1989. And that's why there's ongoing confrontation now between NATO and Russia. But here's the other point. Russia's not going to lose this war. And that means NATO will. Now, what happens then? And I think this is another thing that people are missing because of the censorship and control of the media, that people like Austin and Blinken and Biden and Boris Johnson and Macron and others who keep saying, well, Russia will lose, ultimately Ukraine will win, they're lying. There's no basis for that, in fact. And now the people of Ukraine are starting to rise up. We see the fight breaking out within Kiev over whether Zelensky is right in continuing the fight or not. So I think that these next, let's just say that the next 6 months to a year will be extremely unsettling. And if someone's planning on getting back to normal, forget it. And on top of everything else, John, we have the World Health Organization and other institutions saying there's new, more virulent forms of COVID coming down the pike. You think people will put on masks this time? I don't think so. So, we're facing a moment of truth for humanity. And the only thing you can do is, if you think you know how to discover truth, help other people make that discovery for themselves. Because once people have a sense that they can determine the difference between right and wrong, and they can understand what who's using power to impose their will against the will of the majority, it's in moments like that that the majority can be empowered. Now, it's a big fight because people don't understand these philosophical issues, these economic questions, and so on. But that's why we're here. I mean, I look at that as it's my privilege to be able to talk about these things. And so far, I haven't been thrown in prison or shot. I mean, that could happen. But, it's the ability of people to stand up and present ideas at a moment of crisis that will ultimately determine whether the human race will move ahead or collapse.
Well, we're fortunate to have you, and very fortunate to have the legacy of Lyndon LaRouche and Helga and all the great folks that have written so many great articles in Executive Intelligence Review that have helped to unfold to me a lot of the mysteries and see behind the curtain, at least somewhat. I am very hopeful that you guys are doing great, by the way. I mean, I see your stuff everywhere, and the people are talking about your work all around the world. Your point as to are people going to wear masks again? I think they are, especially if they're Democrats, and that's an interesting thing to observe, the political difference between the people that will wear masks and the people that won't. It's another divide and conquer thing, as far as I'm concerned, and just to keep us into small and clueless groups that cling to each other, but will never constitute a majority. Kind of like the parliaments of France and perhaps even Germany at this time, where coalitions rule, but they don't really have a whole lot of power. And so this is what I'm saying, is that these governments that we're looking at in Europe and the United States and Canada are generally puppets of the financial empire. And again, back to the example of Gaza and the Israelis, why in the hell is President Trump supporting the BB and the Gaza genocide? Why in the hell is Bobby Kennedy Jr. supporting it? Why in the hell is Biden and Kamala and everyone else except for Dr. Shiva? Why are they supporting what is obviously a moral disaster? If not, they are controlled by financial interests that are so powerful that they are pulling their strings, and they do exactly what they're told.
Well, I think that's the answer to that. And I think in the case of Trump, it's that he sees the Christian Zionist faction in the so-called MAGA networks as his support base. And so, people like Reverend John Hagee from San Antonio and those people who are preaching Armageddon, the widow of Adelson, Sheldon Adelson, who was a big funder of Trump. These are people who have a lot of influence. And in Trump's case, I think it's opportunism. I don't think he has a profound commitment to the idea of a coming battle of Armageddon that's going to end up killing all but 144,000 Jews who will recognize the mistake that was made 2,000 years ago when the Jews didn't join Jesus. This is where you see the elements of a cult. Now, it's disappointing when you see someone like Trump, who said he's not going to support the war machine, or Bobby Kennedy, who seemed to have a fairly good head of steam built up in opposing the corporate cartels on COVID and on the war, to see him embrace the Netanyahu regime. But that's if their base starts speaking out more aggressively against those things, and it doesn't mean we don't have to reach everybody, but we do have to get people of courage to stand up and take a position against these things. And I think that's what happened. The example I gave you of East Germany, there were these demonstrations started with 10 people and went on for 6 months with 10 or 12 people on a Monday night. And then all of a sudden, in the beginning of 1989, there were more people who showed up, and there were 100 people. And the next week there were 1,000. And Honecker asked the Stasi, "What the hell's going on? You've got to stop this." And he said, "The next time you've got to go in and start arresting people." Well, the next time there were 10,000 people in Leipzig, and the police stepped back and wouldn't interfere. And when that happened, the whole system collapsed. So, it's a little bit like the Battle of Jericho. Something happens that all of a sudden changes the geometry and gives people a sense of their power. And that's what we have to do. We have to show that this principle of natural law, that there is a limit to the tyrant's power. The worst they can do is kill you. Then you're going to die anyway. The question is, do you live for some reason other than just bodily comfort and money? And that's the answer, the question people have to answer for themselves. So all we can do is present the alternatives and give them a picture of who's controlling things and what the alternative is. That's what made LaRouche the legend that he is, and also what led to the vehement, vile attacks on him, that many people who are now supporting what we're saying said, "Gee, I used to believe this crap about you guys." So let's hope that this is the period where these shifts become permanent, and as the poet Shelley said, "If winter comes, can spring be far behind?" A moment where people can grasp profound and impassioned conceptions about man and nature. That's why we need poets. That's why we need musicians, why we need playwrights, to give us these ideas and to take the power of creativity that exists in every person and bring it out. So, that's our mission.
It's mine too. That's why I want my dad's story to be known, because I think he is an iconic figure in our history that has a place that if you study it, if you understand what he went through and how his life ended, as a result of spending his life trying to preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of our country, then that's my mission, is to try to use his story as a way to enlighten people that no, the powers that are running things right now are corrupt and in many cases evil, and are not going to change unless, as you say, we have a mass awakening, a new great awakening, you might call it, that the people will realize that no, there really is something beyond British empiricism. There is something that probably, I think God is a good word for it, that we have I can't make a blade of grass. I don't know anybody that can. I cannot explain my existence. I don't think anybody legitimately can. I think there's so much spiritual and magical and mystical things that we don't explore because we're so tied into this bean counting world that we lose out a chance to really have a much better perspective on what life really is and what it really can be for the future. And so thank you so much for you've supported my work for a number of years now, and I support yours, and we're hopefully we're making some progress. I really enjoyed our conversation today, Harley, and let you have the last word.
Well, I was just going to say, John, when you find someone who is on their own has discovered some of these truths, it's a realization that these are not so hidden, but they are hidden to the people who aren't looking. And we've got to inspire in people desire for that which is better. Again, we go to Schiller, who writes that we live for that which is better, and not better in terms of more food and more pleasure, but a reason for existence. And we may not be able to answer these questions that you just posed, but we can answer a simple question, which is that no one should be treated like a slave. No one should be treated as someone who has no meaning to their life. And that's what the fight is. And that's why I really would urge people, watch what comes out of the International Court of Justice. It may not be the ruling that we want, but I think the fight is the right one. And it sets the right tone for the months ahead.
All right, Harley Schlanger, thank you so much, sir. And we will talk to you again in a couple of weeks, God willing. Thank you very much. And thanks,
Okay.
everybody, for being with us today.